So I'm delighted to welcome now our second speaker. Professor Daniel Smith is Chair of Psychiatry and Honorary Consultant Psychiatrist and Head of the Division of Psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh. He has had a long-standing clinical and research interest in bipolar disorder and is medical advisor to Bipolar Scotland. He's co-director of the Edinburgh Mental Health Network and leads the UK Mental Health and Circadian Science Network. And he is PI for 2 programme grants funded by the Wellcome Trust, Helios BD and Ambient BD, which we're delighted he's come to tell us more about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about light and lithium and bipolar disorder. Apologies if you've heard this talk before. I've been giving it quite a lot over the last few weeks, and you'll see why. And you might even get to hear it in 2 days' time again as well. I'm going to cover initially some basic facts that you may or may not be aware of. And the first is that every aspect of biology is tied to the cycle of night and day. So every physiological, biochemical, behavioral response from bacteria through plants right up to humans is really timed to coincide with this rhythm that the Earth rotates through every 24 hours. And that's fundamental for any research in biology, but particularly in humans. And unsurprisingly, the way that we've evolved means that these rhythms of, for example, rest, activity, metabolism, inflammation, they're fundamental for the way that we survive and the way that we thrive. Perhaps a little known fact is that every one of us in this room, if we were tortured and made to stay awake for 4 days in a row, we would experience hallucinations and delusions and abnormal experiences. So that kind of tells you just how fundamentally important something like sleep deprivation or massive dysregulation of circadian function is. And that's not something, surprisingly, that people have investigated. I mean, there's obviously ethical reasons why you can't investigate that, but that phenomenon of psychosis induced by sleep deprivation and the mechanism of that is not very well understood, even though we've known it for 50 plus years. So what I'm going to argue today is that disruption in sleep and circadian function is both a symptom of bipolar disorder, but it's also a cause of the symptoms, and it may even be a way to treat bipolar disorder as well. As I've just mentioned, we've been evolving for millions of years. We've been doing that in a pre-industrial, pre-urban era. Like the industrial revolution is a blink of a kind of evolutionary eye, really. It's nothing in terms of how our deep-seated regulatory mechanisms of homeostasis have evolved. So we're not well suited to the way that we live today in any way. A small point that we might come back to is the fact that some medicines work differently at different times of the day. So there's a whole area of chronotherapeutics, which is about timing when you take your medicine to have a maximal effect. We don't think about that at all in psychiatry yet. So as I said, circadian disruption is the problem, but it might even be the solution. And that's the kind of background to my talk. What do I mean by circadian rhythms? Well, this is a diagram really just to show on the right-hand side daylight and darkness on the left-hand side, and just to illustrate that different biological and physiological and behavioral functions vary according to the time of day. So your blood pressure is highest at 6 p.m. Melatonin, a sort of sleep-related hormone, peaks as we go into the evening time. Our cortisol is highest as we wake up in the morning. Our attention is greatest at different times. We can do maths, I think, best at 2 p.m., for example. So all of this is very tightly controlled according to the day and night cycle. And the most important way that we ensure that those cycles stay on time on a day-to-day basis across seasons is light exposure. So light is the most important way to regulate rhythms of rest and activity as well as physiology. And I'll come back to that, as you won't be surprised to hear. So light comes in through the eye, goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, eventually the signal does, and that sort of orchestrates the coordination of clocks in every part of the body that keeps things in rhythm. And non-light stimuli, like when you eat your meals when you interact with other people. They're also important sort of timekeepers as well, but they're not as important as light exposure. And I should say light exposure in the morning is very good. Light exposure when it's dark in general is very bad. And we all have different sensitivities to that. I'll just quickly mention this. This will be familiar to many of you. Bipolar is common. It can be very heterogeneous. It affects different people differently. It can be devastating, but it can also be well controlled. People die younger for complex reasons, some of which are metabolic. We do have a gold standard treatment, which is called lithium, and which is sadly not being used to the extent that it should be used. And that's like an open goal for psychiatry, to have more people with bipolar disorder being treated with lithium more regularly would be a quick win for in all sorts of ways. But this talks about how circadian disruption is actually core to the pathophysiology of bipolar disorder. And I'm going to elaborate on that just now. So I'm part of the International Society of Bipolar Disorders Chronobiology Task Force. And we've written a series of position papers on the importance of circadian rhythms in bipolar particularly. And this is one of them that I've given you the reference there if you want to read more detail about this. But essentially, circadian rhythms are important at every level of understanding the pathophysiology of bipolar disorder. So right from the multiple genes of small effect that increase an individual's predisposition to bipolar, right through things like neurotransmission of serotonin, for example, and dopamine, then into these systems like the autonomic system, the inflammatory system, and metabolic system, right through to behaviors. And I guess one of the problems in psychiatry is that people have been studying these systems or mechanisms in isolation, but we need to be much more ambitious. We need to think about how, a fundamental mechanism might link a lot of this together. So circadian dysregulation speaks to immune dysregulation, speaks to metabolic dysregulation, speaks to different types of symptoms in bipolar disorder. So that's our big interest. How can we use chronobiology to better understand all of these mechanistic aspects of bipolar illness? So just moving on a little bit so the clocks went back. You won't have failed to notice that you got an extra hour in bed this weekend, but that'll disrupt your sleep in the next few days. I don't know whether people woke very early this morning, but it takes about 5 or 6 days for your body to realize that the clocks have actually gone back. And at different times of the year, that's easier or more difficult. So the amount of sun that hits the UK at different times of the year varies considerably. So this slide just shows that, as you all know, in Scotland especially, we get a lot of daylight and sunlight. Well, not so much sunlight, but a lot of daylight in the summer months, which really, really changes rapidly in the autumn time as we go into winter. And equally, that changes rapidly as we move out of spring into summer. And that's really important for bipolar people because they rely particularly on light as a regulator of their mood and behavior. And this is a systematic review of studies that have looked at answering the question, do people with bipolar disorder get admitted to hospital with different episodes of illness at different times of the year? And the answer to that seems to be yes, that in spring, summer, there's a peak for admissions for mania. And as we move into autumn and winter, there's a peak for admissions in depression. And that really just tells us that, the way that light exposure changes throughout the year can be a really important risk factor for people with bipolar disorder. And many people with bipolar disorder have known this for years. And it's why some of them wear blue light blocking glasses, for example, in spring and summer in the evenings in Scotland. So what this leads to is the possibility that we know there are genetic vulnerabilities to bipolar disorder, and we know that early life adversity can be a risk factor for bipolar disorder. But actually an additional sort of critical component of becoming ill with mania or becoming ill with depression might be the rate of change and the amount of sun that's hitting the earth at different times of the year. So that this triple hit hypothesis.
Suddenly said they can't see.
Okay. Is that okay? So, as I was saying, it's the rapid change in the amount of light at different times of the year that may be an additional risk factor for relapse. So just moving on now to think about circadian rhythms and an example of a circadian rhythm. So melatonin is a hormone that's released in a very regular circadian everyday pattern. It's very sensitive to changes in light, so that during the day when the sun is shining or there's daylight, melatonin suppression is sort of reduced. But as soon as we move into the evening and daylight gives way to dusk and to darkness, melatonin in the brain and the body increases. And that's one of the reasons that we go off to sleep in the evening. So exposure to daylight in the morning helps us to have that regular rhythm of melatonin peaks as we move into the evening. And that's why daylight in the morning is important for getting to sleep in the evening time. And conversely, too much light at night, just as your melatonin is supposed to be peaking, can be really unhelpful and can both delay and reduce the amount of melatonin that's secreted, and therefore can interfere with rhythms like sleep. And it looks like bipolar people are super sensitive to the effects of light on melatonin secretion. So this is an experiment where people with and people without bipolar disorder had bright light shone into their eyes in the evening time, and melatonin secretion was measured. And what it really shows is that we're all sensitive to the adverse effects of light at night. All of us will experience a reduction in our melatonin secretion, but people with bipolar disorder are particularly sensitive to that. They're sort of super sensitive. So that applies even at relatively low light exposure levels, and it's proportionate to the amount of light that's given. So that's really important, and that was recognized a good wee while ago. But much more recently, more sophisticated experiments than that have identified that this does, for a proportion of people anyway with bipolar disorder, there is this super sensitivity of light, particularly blue light, which is good in the morning, but very bad in the evening if you're exposed to it. So here's just another nice experiment demonstrating that bipolar people compared to controls are more likely to experience this melatonin delay when exposed to light in the evening. And even more interestingly, not many people know about this study, but this is a study from Norway that actually tried to block blue light in the evening in people in inpatient units who were admitted with mania. So somehow they managed to get people with mania to wear blue light blocking glasses. And there's a suggestion that that actually sort of accelerates their recovery from mania, but just by blocking light in the evening time in an inpatient setting. So there's other studies trying to replicate this at the minute, but that for me is a really interesting finding because that's a relatively straightforward intervention in theory that people could start thinking about. And equally, bipolar depression, we've known for a while now, bipolar depression is quite responsive to light therapy. So bright light in the morning or around midday has been shown in many randomized controlled trials now to be effective for bipolar depression. So correctly timed light exposure is therapeutic for bipolar disorder. It's all about when you have it. And in the morning, it can be good for depression, and blocking it in the evening can be good for treating mania. So as part of this task force that I'm on, one of the other position papers that you might be interested in is a review of chronotherapies for bipolar across the different episodes of illness. So we look at depression and bright light therapy. Sleep deprivation, interestingly, is a treatment for bipolar depression. Dark therapy, which is a bit like the blue light blocking glasses for mania, is an intervention. And then there's other more focused cognitive interventions like CBT for insomnia, as well as interpersonal social rhythm therapy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that chronotherapies are effective in bipolar disorder, but very, very rarely implemented in everyday practice. And that should be something we probably do a lot more of. So just on that note, as part of the ISBD working group, we created a bunch of videos that are all about seasonality and rhythms and sleep and light and bipolar disorder. So if you're interested, that's the QR code, and you could be one of 100 people who've seen it so far. So I'm trying to publicize this. Okay. Tell your friends. So I want to move on to Sorry, did you need it? I'd hate for anyone to miss out. Okay. So the next part of my talk is about lithium, and where does lithium come into this picture of circadian disruption and light and bipolar disorder? So lithium has been around for 70 plus years now. Many of you will know the story of how it was discovered, but John Cade essentially gave it to overactive guinea pigs. He thought he was giving them citrate, but the citrate was lithium citrate, and lithium citrate actually made the guinea pigs less active, and therefore he gave it to 10 manic patients at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and 9 of them became not manic within about 2 weeks. So it's a real revelation at the time. And he thought it's actually evidence that mania was a vitamin deficiency, a mineral deficiency. He thought it was lack of lithium in the bloodstream that was causing mania. That's because he was a doctor in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in Singapore during the war, and he saw a lot of mineral and vitamin deficiency. So when he came back from the war, he thought quite a lot of mental illness could be related to this. But it's not obviously a mineral deficiency, but it's very striking that it is an anti-manic treatment. And it's been investigated in lots and lots of ways at many levels. So most textbooks will say that lithium affects neurotransmitters, that affects second messenger systems, it affects transcription factors, the hyperexcitability of neurons. And this is all probably true, but it also has quite a strong circadian action. So in chronobiology, it's been used for many years to stabilize rhythms in plants, for example, and other systems. And it shortens the circadian period and regularizes rhythms in humans. And the big hypothesis that we're interested in testing is whether it might work by reducing sensitivity to light in people with bipolar disorder. So what happens if you give lithium to people who don't have bipolar disorder and then assess their melatonin response to that? Well, there's not many experiments like this have been done, but those that have suggest that lithium might make anyone less sensitive to the adverse effects of light at night. So if we all took lithium, small dose for 5 days, our melatonin levels would not be as disrupted when we shone light in our eyes in the evenings. So that's quite important, I think. And that really led us to this hypothesis that I said, that maybe lithium works in bipolar disorder via a circadian mechanism that's got something to do with making people more resilient to the adverse effects of light in the evening. And we're funded as part of the Wellcome Trust's Mental Health Award. And this funding was really about investigating the mechanisms of treatments that we know are effective. So psychiatry's got loads of quite effective treatments, but most of them we don't really understand how they work. So this funding was about drilling down into potential mechanisms of action to try and open up a new area of possible treatment. And what we're interested is in opening up the area of chronotherapeutics. If lithium works via a circadian mechanism, then we should be doing a lot more in terms of chronotherapy. So again, another QR code. I'll put this up at the end again. So the study that I'm going to talk to you about is called HELIOS-BD, lithium's mechanism in bipolar disorder, investigating the light hypersensitivity hypothesis. So we've just had ethics approval for this study. Hopefully we'll have R&D approval in the next week or two. And we're hoping to recruit people starting January of this year to take part in the study. So if you know anyone with bipolar disorder who might be interested in the study, then please pass on the details, because we want, and we're working extremely closely with Bipolar Scotland to recruit people, as well as with services. And we really want everyone in Scotland who has a bipolar diagnosis to know about this study and to be able to take part in this study. And we want some of those people to be on lithium, but not everyone has to be on lithium. So those are the people we're after. So hopefully you can help me spread the word. So as I said, it's investigating lithium. I've said the hypothesis already that it might reduce hypersensitivity to evening light, and it might open up a new way or a better way of treating bipolar disorder. There's a lot to this study. It's 5 years, lots of different work streams. I'll just mention these in passing, but one of the work streams is growing the retinas, growing retinas in a petri dish, essentially derived from people with bipolar disorder, and exposing those retinas in organoids to light and looking at the various outputs in terms of neurotransmitters. Our colleagues in Northumbria and Newcastle are doing that. In Newcastle, they're also going to be giving lithium to people with no history of mental illness to see if they can replicate this effect of a non-visual effect of lithium. And then in Edinburgh, we're doing 3 big work streams and a cross-cutting PPI work stream. The main one we're doing is looking at very detailed studies of people in essentially a sleep lab, comparing non-visual responses to light in bipolar people versus controls, as well as comparing between those who are on lithium and those who are not on lithium to try and look at that in more detail. Then we're also going to do some very detailed psychophysics experiments looking at retinal sensitivity in bipolar disorder and trying to understand that more carefully at the level of the retina. And then we're going to look at microstructural changes in the retina over time in people with bipolar disorder compared to controls, and looking at whether lithium actually might be protective in terms of the sort of neurodegenerative changes at the level of the retina. So it's a very ambitious study, and a big part of it is PPIE and co-production. Many of you will have seen Ian's stand during the break. If you haven't, please go and have a look, because we want to do some really innovative public engagement activities around light perception, around emotions, around AI technology for image generation, etc., etc. So please have a look at. Is it called Landscapes? I've forgotten already. Landscapes, Inner Landscapes. So have a go at that. So that's Helios BD, and I'm happy to answer questions. But I want to just mention the other study, which is called Ambient BD, which is similar. It's on bipolar people, and it's going to be using very novel radar detection of sleep technology. So sort of ambient and passive data collection of sleep rhythms to understand how that might be related to relapse signatures at an individual level. So this is an ambitious study again over 5 years. We want to understand how sleep and rhythms impact on clinical outcomes. We are going to look at novel markers that might allow us to stratify people for different treatment approaches. And it might eventually be important at early intervention levels. So if people are super sensitive to sleep changes and circadian changes in terms of their relapse signature, then that might tell us a different way to approach the treatment of those individuals. So quite a lot of the work in the first 2 years of Ambient BD is about developing the methods carefully, testing the acceptability and the feasibility and the performance of the assessments. That's one of the radar devices in the corner. It's called Somnify, and it's just a little device that sits in the corner of your bedroom innocuously and can tell when you're sleeping according to your breathing rate and your heart rate and your movement rate. Even if there's 2 of you in the room, you can still detect the one who's sleeping. So the idea is that we're going to use this technology to monitor people in detail over long periods, something that's not really been possible before. So then we're going to do a prospective follow-up study, and we're going to look at using machine learning to kind of predict relapse at individual levels. So this is what the longitudinal study looks like. People will be assessed the whole time for 18 months continuously in terms of their daily sleep rhythms. Then every 4 to 5 months, we will ask them to do smartphone recording of ecological momentary assessments of mood and behavior. We'll do that intermittently. And then intermittently, we'll also look at their clinical outcomes. But the whole point really is to design a study that is not very burdensome for participants. So essentially, bipolar people who volunteer for this study will only have to interact with us face-to-face on 3 or 4 occasions, but most of the time during the study, we will be collecting data in other ways to inform their outcomes. So again, Ambient BD is just getting up and running, but we will be recruiting in about 18 months. We'll probably start recruiting in Scotland for the main prospective study. And you can keep track of that if you go on the website. A big part of Ambient BD is, again, lived experience involvement. Bipolar Scotland have been really helpful in terms of designing these studies, but also in terms of lived experience panels, etc. We have peer researchers on the work. We're going to be co-producing our dissemination plans, etc., etc. And one of the original things we're going to do is try to compose original music compositions based on the EEGs of people with bipolar disorder, and using the oscillations that are part of brain rhythms to generate novel musical compositions, and maybe even put on a concert by bipolar musicians based on music derived from their own brain waves, which sounds very grandiose, but that's kind of where we're going, and that's our ambition with the dissemination activities in that project. So yeah, have a look on the website if you're interested. And then just before I finish, we've been funded. We're very keen on this area, as you may have picked up. So we think circadian mental health is a massively under-researched area. So we've set up a UK-wide network to stimulate collaborative research. We want chronobiologists to work with mental health researchers and vice versa. So if you're interested in this area and you're a researcher and you'd like to be part of the circadian mental health network, there's all sorts of opportunities for support and funding that we can provide, especially if you're an early career researcher and would like to develop collaborations. So go on the circadianmentalhealth.org and have a look at that. So to summarize, I think my key take-home messages are as follows. I've been trying to link light, circadian rhythms, and bipolar disorder with lithium therapy. And what I'd like you to go away with today is well, I think it's a fact, really, that circadian changes in energy, activity, and sleep are the core features of bipolar disorder. They might even be more important than people's mood and how they're feeling. So it's about energy dysregulation. Maybe it's the primary dysfunction in terms of symptoms. As I've said, people with bipolar are super sensitive to seasonal changes in the amount of sun hitting the earth at different times of the year. This leads to more depression in autumn and more mania in spring and summer. Light in the morning is how we regulate our rhythms. So it's a primary regulator of sleep and maybe therapeutic in bipolar depression. And conversely, blocking light at night may be therapeutic in bipolar mania. So that's a big message. And then the key thing that we're testing in HELIOS-BD particularly is a novel mechanism of action for probably the most effective treatment in psychiatry, namely lithium for bipolar. So does it work by stabilizing circadian rhythms? And does it do that via an action at the level of the retina? And can we understand that more fully by these detailed studies? I'll just stop by thanking my team, some of which are and collaborators, some of which are in the audience. Too many to mention. There's quite a lot of people, not only in Edinburgh, but in our collaborators in Newcastle and Germany and elsewhere. So thanks to everyone there. And this is your last chance to get the QR code for HELIOS-BD. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as you'll probably know, lithium mechanisms of action is something I'm really interested in. There's been lots of debate about how lithium works, whether that's intracellular signaling pathways, or could it be anti-inflammation and the release of healthy chemicals, or is it actually the variation in circadian rhythms? So I think these are really, really important studies. So how can clinicians help?
In lots of ways. So I'm glad you asked. So yeah, it's a massive recruitment drive really from January over the next, we're recruiting people for the next 24, 36 months. So there's lots of time for people to volunteer, but we are involved with trusts all over the country. So there'll be patient identification centres in every sort of trust. So local clinicians can help us by publicising the study, but also being aware that it's happening and making it available to patients and families. But also if they wanted to get more involved in the dissemination activities, any of that kind of PPIE work, very happy to have clinicians involved in those groups as well. So yeah, publicising, helping us recruit, and just spreading the word really.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Do we have any questions online? Okay, and any questions in the room? Yes, we do. We'll go here first. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, that was very informative, and I felt as though I knew about this and you've renewed my interest. But I've got a question. You're all based on light entering the eye. I deal a lot with blind people, and I'm just wondering, is all this rubbish for them? Because they're not all mentally ill and they're not all bipolar. How does it affect them?
So yeah, so blind people have all sorts of issues with sleep and circadian disruption for complex reasons. Yeah, so, and there's different types of blindness as well, isn't there? So there's different causes of blindness. So, so what I'd say in general is that, yeah, most people who are blind do really struggle with that regulation of sleep that is dependent upon light exposure at the right times of day. But that's not bipolar specific. That's not related to bipolar disorder. That's a sort of separate issue. Is your question about bipolar people who happen to be blind? Or?
No, it's about how does it affect them not having light? Because I know a lot of blind people, some have no eyes, they're just born with no eyes. Some are blind, but they know light from dark.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering,
So
is this irrelevant to them?
No, it's very relevant. Light exposure is very relevant to everybody. So some of them will have what's called free running periods, so where their circadian rhythms will just run in a kind of natural 12 hours on, 12 hours off of sleep, for example. And that's incredibly disruptive if you think that the rest of the world is according to clocks and daylight. And so some blind people really have major issues with when they go to sleep and when they feel tired and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Do we have another question somewhere? Oh, yeah.
Danny, all our devices have got night modes on them these days. Do you think that personal devices can be bright enough to affect sleep rhythms? And do you think that the changing from blue to warmer tones makes any difference to the sleep disruption?
So lots of people are trying to investigate that, not least sort of mobile phone manufacturers. So yeah, I mean, it depends. There's a lot of variation in how sensitive people are to blue light. So some people are really super sensitive and will get migraine and feel headaches even just by looking at their computer in the evening and stuff. Other people are more resilient. So there's a big difference. And it's not just about blue light exposure. It's about being emotionally activated in the evening on your phone, social media, your brain's too active, etc. So it's really hard to separate out the ill effects of being overactivated from the blue light effects. So I think the honest answer is it's not very clear, and it's likely to be quite an individual sort of response. But so nobody, you should, as you know, Donald, no one should be looking at their phone after 10 p.m. I mean, we tell teenagers, like we try to take phones off teenagers, so we should all just turn our phones off at 10 p.m. because we're not evolved to look at phones at 10 p.m.
I remember a few years ago there was a particular interest in light boxes and seasonal affective disorder, but it's really fallen out of fashion. Do you think, I can't remember if those studies excluded people on lithium or if it was any treatments. Do you think that although those studies came out variable as to whether the light boxes did any good, do you think that perhaps some of those people on lithium had this light sensitivity and that explains some of the variability of results that came out back then?
I mean, it depends what the studies were of. So if it was seasonal affective disorder, that's complicated in lots of ways. But I think the bipolar community are quite into light boxes in the winter. So you find many people with bipolar will routinely get a light box and find that helpful for them. So they're already doing it because it works. They don't need an RCT to tell them. So so I would just say it depends what the problem is trying to be treated. I think the light box industry is thriving again, to be honest. I think like lots of the general population are using light manipulation especially in northern latitudes, to kind of manage and it's about managing their energy levels. So it's not, many people use it not just because of low mood, it's about feeling too tired and lacking in energy in the wintertime. And some light exposure in the morning is a good thing for that. So I think there's a renaissance of interest in light boxes.
Yeah, great, thank you. Oh, we do have an online question. Is my microphone working here? Yes, good. Okay, lovely. Danny, is it likely that there are also post-retinal visual pathway effects of lithium?
Yes. I'm going to ask Amber to give the full answer to that. No. Yes, there definitely is. And it might not just be the retina. So there could, but we're hoping to investigate that at some level.
Okay, and time for one more quick question.
Hi, Danny. I'm interested in what the military make of sleep deprivation, because I believe that they use it with training soldiers for heightened awareness. Is that correct?
Well, they use it for torture. So heightened awareness, I don't, I mean, it depends. Yeah, like sleep deprivation for 1 or 2 days is pro mood. So all of us get a bit giddy after you've been up all night. You can get that sort of morning kind of giddiness, and you feel a bit sort of destabilized. But it seems like a bad strategy in the military setting to make people more attentive. No, so I'm not aware of that. No.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Smith.